Okay, so we're talking about people improving, gradually going up on their, moving from low functioning to higher functioning. How does that do it? How does that happen from your perspective and to, like from their perspective? What do you do and what do they do to improve?
Okay. Yeah, okay, that's a really individualized question because another phrase you've heard about people with Asperger's, or you may have heard, is that if you've met one person with Asperger's, you've met one person with Asperger's. Basically, what that means is just like everybody else, people with Asperger's or people on the autism spectrum are individuals. So,
Yeah.
although they may have certain traits in common, they also have many individual differences as well. So, some people on the spectrum may need to learn to improve their perspective taking. Um, Other people on the spectrum, and we didn't talk about this, but oftentimes people on the spectrum are very literal. They hear things very concretely, so they may need to learn, to develop better abstract thinking or to learn more about sarcasm and, when people are kind of friendly teasing versus mean teasing. So it really depends upon what the person needs. A lot of people on the spectrum need to learn to manage their anxiety. Some need to learn to develop better anger management and frustration skills. Some need just to develop better social skills. So if you see a friend who's wearing a new dress that makes them look a little bit fat, you don't say, boy, that kind of makes you look fat, because their feelings might get hurt.
Don't be as honest.
Don't be as honest. That's something that a lot of people on the spectrum have to learn, is kind of the value of a white lie.
Oh. Okay, so we've just talked about certain examples of what people work on, but could you give like each one of those examples, if you can, like strategies? Like what do you have like any exercises?
Okay, sure. And again, it really depends upon what situation you're working with. And let me say this: one of the things that I think is most important for people on the spectrum, particularly people higher on the spectrum, is to first of all embrace who they are. A lot of times they've had a lot of struggles in their life, either in school or with relationships, and some kids I've worked with have felt angry about being diagnosed with a spectrum disorder. Some love it because they love their uniqueness. Some could care less. But I think embracing what makes them unique and being able to talk about it with other people is tremendously helpful. So one strategy is figuring out, how are you going to talk about your autism spectrum? Who are you going to tell? Do you have to tell everybody, or are there only certain people? If you have a girlfriend, you want to tell your girlfriend? Should you tell your teachers or your professors? And that's kind of called disclosure or partial disclosure. But one boy that I worked with, who when he was in middle school, he was in a self-contained classroom because of lots of behavior problems, and he had been diagnosed with Asperger's. And he was very angry, had lots of behavior issues, didn't like having Asperger's. Over time, he started to do much better, and as he began to understood Asperger's and realized that he had a lot of strengths that came with it, his humor, his writing ability, he really began to embrace his Asperger's, and he wouldn't give it up for anything, and he began to thrive and be really successful, and is now at a 4-year college. So one thing to do is learn to embrace yourself. Another intervention that I find really helpful for a lot of people on the spectrum is social stories, and this can really cover the spectrum, because people lower on the autism spectrum, you write social stories with pictorial cues. So maybe the social story might be on making friends, and you write a social story with pictures on how to join in and make friends. For somebody higher I wrote social stories for kids on the spectrum who are in college. And a social story is basically, you take a social situation the person is struggling with, and you write down what's expected in that situation. That intervention tends to be very beneficial. So for a kid who's maybe often very blunt and too honest. You might write a social story on, it's important that we remember sometimes if we're too blunt or honest, we might hurt somebody else's feelings. We need to think about, if I make this comment, how the other person is going to respond. And that type of intervention tends to be really helpful for people on the spectrum. Sometimes, if it's a person on the spectrum who's struggling with anxiety, the strategies are the same strategies you teach anybody who's struggling with anxiety. You teach them coping skills like deep breathing, meditation, how to challenge their thought process so that they change their anxious thoughts into more calming thoughts. So a lot of times, some of the treatment interventions you're doing with people on the spectrum are very similar to strategies you're doing with people who are not on the spectrum.
Okay.